Welcome to Quiet Badges Stories. I'm glad you made it here today. If this one pulls you in, hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from. I read every single one. Now, let me tell you about Joanna Reeves. She never raised her voice inside Piedmont Valley Trauma Center. Not once in 2.5 years. She never corrected a physician in front of others. Never pushed back when her name was left off the commendation board. Never let her hands react to anything her face wasn't already prepared to absorb. She had learned, early and completely, that the fastest way to survive in a hospital was to make everyone around her feel like the smartest person in whatever room she was standing in. Dr. Preston had made her his favorite example. Not because she made mistakes, she rarely did, but because she never fought back. Men like Dr. Craig Preston had a particular instinct for finding the kind of quiet that could be mistaken for weakness, and they pressed against it the way a child presses a bruise, curious whether it would ever actually break. She had let him, 2.5 years of it. The morning everything began to unravel started the same way every other morning had. Preston announced, in front of 4 residents and the charge nurse, that Joanna had set up a traction splint incorrectly on a patient in Bay 3. He was wrong. She had set it up exactly as her training. The training nobody in that hospital knew she had required for a suspected femoral fracture with compromised distal pulse. She had checked the pulse twice. She had documented it. Preston hadn't looked at the chart. He had glanced at the setup and seen something that didn't match the textbook diagram he had memorized during a rotation 12 years ago. She apologized, adjusted, walked away. In the supply room, alone, she allowed herself 30 seconds. She pressed her back against the shelving unit and breathed the way she had been taught to breathe under pressure. Slow, from the diaphragm, deliberate. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed. In other places, in other years, she had used that kind of ambient noise as confirmation that nothing in the immediate environment was actively trying to kill her. It was a strange benchmark. It worked. She straightened her badge and walked back out. Nobody at Piedmont Valley knew that the woman in the 2 big navy scrubs had a different name and a different life. They didn't know about the 18 months she had spent embedded with a special operations support element, in places that didn't appear on the maps civilians were cleared to see. They didn't know about the field trauma rotations, the qualification courses she had completed, before most of her current coworkers had finished their nursing boards, the number of times her hands had worked in conditions that bore no resemblance to a lit trauma bay with a full equipment tray within reach. They didn't know about WRAITH, the call sign given to her by men and women who had trusted her with their lives and received their lives back in return. She had chosen Roanoke the same way she had chosen everything since leaving, deliberately, quietly, with the specific goal of disappearing into something large enough to hide her and small enough that no one would look twice. The name Reeves came from her grandmother. The navy scrubs were 2 sizes too large. The stillness she wore like a second skin had taken 3 months to build after years of operating at a pace that left no room for it. For 2.5 years, it had worked perfectly. The trauma bay radio crackled at 10 past midnight on a Tuesday in April, and the charge nurse's voice tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the words she was relaying. 2 vehicles, high-speed collision. That alone would have been ordinary. It was the second part that changed the room. A federal transport vehicle involved. A gunshot wound sustained prior to the accident, blast exposure possible. Patient identified only as a priority-level government casualty. No name, no history. Just the particulars that suggested whatever came through those ambulance doors in 4 minutes was not going to be a bad night at the ER in the usual sense. Preston positioned himself at the front of the incoming bay. Joanna took her place to the side, where she always stood, close enough to be useful, far enough back that no one noticed she had already started reading the situation before the doors opened. When the ambulance bay doors swung back, the sound hit first. Monitors alarming. Paramedics calling numbers that weren't good. A man on the gurney, thick-shouldered, gray-haired, his clothing cut away across his chest and left arm, not civilian clothes but the layered, tactical kind that people wore under dress uniforms when they expected the unexpected. His face was the color of old wax. 2 men in plain clothes ran alongside the gurney, moving with the specific economy of people who had spent years practicing how not to look like what they were. Preston stepped forward, called orders, sounded confident. That was the thing about Preston. He always sounded confident. Joanna had come to understand that this quality was entirely separate from whether he was right. The man on the gurney opened his eyes. They were dark brown, deep-set, and they moved through the trauma bay the way experienced eyes always moved through an unfamiliar space, not tracking the equipment, not reading room numbers, but cataloging faces, cataloging exits, making the rapid assessment of someone who had spent decades operating in rooms where that assessment determined what came next. He was doing it automatically, even now, even on his back with his chest barely rising. His gaze found Joanna and stopped. She felt the recognition arrive before his lips moved. 2.5 years of careful nothing, and it ended with a look that lasted less than 3 seconds. His right arm came up, trembling, weak, but deliberate. His finger extended toward her across the full width of the trauma bay, and his voice cut through every alarm and every shouted order in the room, with a force that made no medical sense for a man losing as much blood as he was. "WRAITH," he said. "I only accept WRAITH." The room stopped. Preston's hands hovered over the patient's chest, suspended mid-action. The paramedic relaying vitals went silent mid-sentence. The 2 plainclothes men at the foot of the gurney turned toward Joanna with a synchronized precision that had nothing to do with hospital training. Joanna stood completely still. She knew that voice. She had not heard it in over 4 years, but she knew it the way you know the sound of your own name spoken in a language you were supposed to have left behind. General Rex Hollis. Retired 2-star. The man who had stood 30 feet from her in a desert with no official name, and watched her work for 11 uninterrupted minutes on a teammate who was bleeding out. And at the end of those 11 minutes, the man was alive and she was still moving. Hollis had said 4 words that had meant more than any commendation that followed. "You earned that name." WRAITH. Because she moved through chaos without making noise and left things better than she found them. The shorter of the 2 plainclothes men, compact, jaw set like poured concrete, stepped forward and said, without raising his voice, "Let her through." Preston's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out. Joanna was already moving. She stepped to Hollis's right side and looked at him the way she had been trained to look at a patient, not at his face but at the whole picture: skin color, the rise and fall of his chest, the asymmetry in how it moved, the distension of the veins along his neck that had no business being there if the problem were only blood loss from the shoulder wound, the blood pressure that had been dropping on the monitor at a rate that should have alarmed Preston 5 minutes ago. He wasn't dying from the gunshot wound in his shoulder. The shoulder wound was survivable. What was happening inside his left chest was not in the time remaining. Blood was filling the space between his left lung and the chest wall, accumulating with every heartbeat, compressing the lung, beginning to shift pressure against the heart and the vessels running beside it. A tension hemothorax. Not air, blood under building pressure, doing from the inside what no external threat had managed to accomplish outside this room. His body was compensating the way a trained soldier's body compensates under punishment, efficiently, quietly, in ways that masked how close the edge actually was. The monitor numbers were still close enough to normal that Preston hadn't understood what he was looking at. But the numbers were lagging. The damage was not. What Joanna was seeing in the next 60 seconds would either be acted on or it would not. If it was not, the heart, squeezed and shifted and fighting an impossible load, would simply stop. This is what tension hemothorax does, and why it kills faster than most of what emergency departments are built to treat. Blood under pressure in the chest cavity behaves exactly like a hand closing around the heart from the outside. The lung on the affected side collapses. The mediastinum, the structure containing the heart and the major vessels, shifts toward the opposite side. The veins distend because blood returning to the heart has nowhere to go. The blood pressure drops, then falls, then stops being enough to sustain circulation at all. The clinical signs arrive in sequence: labored breathing, neck veins bulging, the blood pressure reading that no amount of IV fluid will correct because the problem is not volume, it is pressure. The emergency intervention, in a trauma bay, in a field hospital, in the back of a vehicle in the dark, is to release that pressure through the chest wall before the heart gives out. It requires knowing exactly where to enter. It requires hands that do not hesitate. Joanna's hands did not hesitate. She reached for the tray. Preston found his voice. "Nurse, you are not authorized to." "Tension hemothorax, left side," she said. The voice that came out of her was not the voice she had used in this building for 2.5 years. It was flat and clear and completely certain. "The pressure is compressing his heart. He won't survive transport to surgery. He needs decompression now. I am the attending physy." The taller plainclothes man took 1 step forward and said, "Doctor, move." It was not a request. Preston moved. Joanna located the landmark on Hollis's chest with her fingertips, the 4th intercostal space, mid-axillary line. The anatomy her hands knew before her brain finished the sequence, because it had been drilled into her in conditions that bore no resemblance to this room, and could not be unlearned regardless of how many years of Navy scrubs were layered on top. She worked quickly, cleanly, with the specific, economical precision of someone doing a procedure they had done in the worst possible conditions, and were now doing in the best. The moment the pressure released, the room changed. Hollis's oxygen saturation, which had been sliding steadily toward a number from which recovery became unlikely, turned around on the monitor. His color, that waxy, terrible gray, began coming back. His breathing, which had been shallow and labored and losing the fight, eased into something the room could finally describe as stable. For 3 full seconds, nobody spoke. Then the taller plainclothes man, whose name was Reeves, though nobody in that room knew it yet, looked at Joanna's hands where they were still working, and said quietly to no one in particular, "Those are not a floor nurse's hands." Joanna heard Preston exhale somewhere behind her. "No," said the shorter man, "they are not." Dr. Linwood arrived 20 minutes later with the posture of a man who had been woken by a phone call that did not match any scenario he had prepared for. He found Joanna in the hallway outside radiology and told her, in careful, procedural language, that she was suspended pending a credentialing review. She listened, looked at the form he slid toward her, and did not reach for it. Rains appeared at the end of the hallway before Linwood finished speaking. What Rains said was brief and left no space for the kind of rebuttal Linwood had walked in prepared to deliver. The substance of it was this: General Hollis was not a routine patient. His transport had been arranged under protocols Linwood's attorney lacked the clearance to review. The men stationed outside the general's room were not hospital security, and the individual just suspended for saving his life was the most qualified person in the building. A fact that was about to matter considerably, because what had happened tonight was not finished. "What do you mean, not finished?" Linwood asked. Becker, the shorter of the 2 men, compact and perpetually positioned between Hollis's room and the nearest exit, had already flagged a figure in the main corridor. No badge, no destination. Eyes moving wrong, reading the layout instead of looking for a room number. There were 2 of them, it turned out, moving from different directions toward the same point on the floor plan. The kind of approach that required communication, planning, and a reason that had nothing to do with visiting hours. Joanna absorbed the information, and her mind did what it had been doing quietly for 2.5 years without anyone noticing. It mapped every floor she had walked during 1,000 shifts and supply runs and quiet nights. Every stairwell, every service corridor, every choke point between the main entrance and the east wing where Hollis now lay. She had never written any of it down. She had never told anyone she was doing it. She had done it the way she had been trained to do everything, as a reflex, as a habit, as the particular kind of awareness that does not switch off simply because the circumstances no longer seem to require it. "We move him," she said. "There's a procedure suite on the east end. Single entrance, no exterior windows. It connects to the service corridor behind radiology, the only through route in this wing without public access. I've walked it probably 300 times. Rains looked at her steadily. "Lead the way." Moving Hollis required coordinating 4 people without alerting 2 men currently inside the building. Joanna did it with economy and clarity and no wasted words, pulling in a charge nurse and 2 techs she had worked beside long enough to trust, giving each of them a specific task and a specific reason that was true enough to be followed and vague enough not to cause panic. Preston materialized near the nurse's station as the transfer was being prepared. He looked at Joanna with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not arrogance. Something closer to a man realizing he had been working from an incomplete picture for a very long time. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Keep the front department running," she said. "Make it look like a normal shift." He nodded. He went and did exactly that, and she did not have time to be surprised by it. The procedure suite was where she said it would be. Hollis transferred without incident, and Joanna positioned the team around him the way she had positioned teams around casualties, in places that also did not have official names. Becker took the service corridor junction. Rains stayed inside with the radio. The first intruder reached the east wing by the stairwell she had expected him to use, the only one that didn't require a badge swipe after hours, the same one she had used herself once during a code when the elevator was occupied. She cut the lighting in 2 adjacent corridors from a maintenance panel she had noticed 8 months ago. In the dark, in a floor plan he had studied but never walked, the man made 2 wrong turns that cost him 9 minutes and brought him toward Becker instead of the procedure suite. Becker handled it the way Becker handled everything, with precision, with economy, and without a single unnecessary word. The second man was more careful, and it showed in how he moved. Joanna tracked him by sound, the specific weight of someone in hard soles being deliberate on linoleum, and stayed 2 positions ahead of him through corridors that were not dark to her, because she knew where every switch was and exactly which ones she had turned off. She did not engage him directly. She triggered the automated doors to the imaging suite from the far panel, flooding a section of corridor with sudden light and the beeping of an unsecured room, and he moved toward it the way people always move toward unexpected stimulus, away from his route, toward Rains, who was already repositioned and waiting. Federal backup arrived 43 minutes after the building was secure. By the time agents in windbreakers swept the corridors, there were 2 restrained men to account for, and a charge nurse in the break room who needed 15 minutes and a glass of water before she could finish her sentence. The lead agent, a woman named Corbin, who moved with the particular economy Joanna recognized and respected, asked 40 minutes of careful questions in a borrowed conference room. "You're not going to tell me your full operational history," Corbin said near the end. It wasn't a question. "No," Joanna said. Corbin studied her. "Tonight's incident report will reflect training consistent with your documented background. The specific nature of that background will not appear in any civilian filing connected to this facility." She paused at the door. "For what it's worth, he's been asking for you since he came back around." Hollis was sitting up when Joanna entered, pale and attached to more equipment than she would have liked, but awake, and his eyes were clear. "You shouldn't have had to do any of that," he said. "Not the decompression, not tonight, none of it." "It needed doing," she said. "I know." He looked at her for a long moment. "People assumed the worst when you disappeared. Some of them still do." "I needed them to," she said. "For a while I needed that." He nodded in the way of a man who understood there was an entire story beneath 4 words and wasn't going to push against it. "Are you done?" Joanna considered the question. The real version of it, not the polite one. Whether the answer she had been living for 2.5 years still held. "I think," she said finally, "I confused disappearing with healing. I got very good at the first one." Hollis reached out and put his hand briefly over hers. "Then maybe it's time to work on the second. Somewhere they let you actually use what you know." Linwood reversed the suspension in writing, quietly, before the credentialing board convened. He also requested a private meeting with Joanna, closed his office door, and said something she hadn't expected. "I made an assumption based on a credential file and missed the person entirely. I won't do that again." It wasn't a full apology, but it was honest, and honesty from someone who found it costly was worth more to her than easy words from someone who had nothing to lose. Preston changed after that week, not dramatically. Joanna didn't believe in that kind of story, but something in the architecture of his certainty had shifted. He stopped leading with conclusions. He started asking questions, which was something she had not seen him do in 2.5 years. He started asking her questions specifically, and the first few times she could see it cost him something real, and she respected that cost without commenting on it. The residents around him noticed. That was what mattered. He never apologized directly. She didn't need him to. What she needed was for the people in training to watch a senior physician defer to a nurse's clinical judgment without requiring a crisis to make it happen, and slowly, that was beginning to occur. Raines visited 3 weeks later, ostensibly to check on Hollis's recovery. Actually, she was fairly certain, to see how she was. He brought coffee. They sat in the break room for 20 minutes and talked around the edges of things. The way people who have operated in the same world talk when they're trying to be ordinary. "There's a program," he said, standing to leave. "Bridging military trauma medicine and civilian emergency care. Teaching field techniques to hospital teams. Teaching hospital protocols to combat medics. The gap between them costs leaves in both directions." "I know," she said. "They're looking for someone who's lived on both sides of it." She didn't answer that day, but she thought about it on the walk home through streets that looked like any other streets in any other mid-sized city. Past the coffee shop, past the dry cleaner, past the parking garage, where she had sat in her car on her first night in Roanoke and told herself that invisible was the same as safe. It wasn't. She understood that now. She had understood it for longer than she admitted. She had just needed 2.5 years and one impossible night to stop pretending otherwise. General Rex Hollis was discharged on a Thursday morning in late April, walking out of Piedmont Valley Trauma Center under his own strength, which his surgeon described as ahead of schedule, and which Joanna, watching from the nurse's station, understood simply as consistent with who he was. He stopped at the station on the way out. He shook her hand with both of his, in front of the morning staff, in front of Preston and the charge nurse and 2 residents who had heard the story in pieces and wanted to see the person the pieces added up to. "You were never hiding from the work," he said quietly, before his security moved them toward the exit. "You were only waiting until the work needed you badly enough to make hiding pointless." The doors slid shut behind him. The monitors kept beeping. A phone rang at the front desk. The morning shift settled back into its ordinary rhythm, the way things always settle after something extraordinary, not by forgetting, but by continuing, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Joanna turned back to the board, picked up a chart, and got to work, not smaller than before, not performing anything for anyone, just exactly as much of herself as the situation required, which, it turned out, had always been enough, more than enough. She didn't need the scrubs 2 sizes too large anymore. That's Joanna's story, and I hope it stayed with you the way it stayed with me. If it did, hit that like button and subscribe to Quiet Badge's stories. There's another one on the way, and I think you're going to want to be here for it. Drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you hardest. I read every single one. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you next time.